You're listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We believe the Bible doesn't need to be watered down or cleaned up to be understood. Our goal is to provide a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. I'm your host, Colin Connor. Now, on to the episode. When most people think about the battle between good and evil in the Bible, they usually think of God versus Satan. But Satan, as we think of him, is rarely the main antagonist in any Bible story. More often than not, it's a story of God against the gods of the nations. Gods like Baal and Chemosh and Ashtaroth, Dagon, Diana, Tammuz, and the list just goes on, are caught up in fights against Yahweh, the God of the Bible. And to most people, they'll read those names and just imagine them as personifications of lifeless idols. But what if I told you that the gods of the Bible were real? Creations of Yahweh, made to help him rule over the cosmos, but who later rebelled against him. If that sounds crazy to you, you're not alone. That is a view that a lot of people are not familiar with. But that was the view of the biblical authors. This week we're going to dive into the first few verses of Genesis chapter 6. And that's a passage that can easily get overlooked as people are just on their way into the flood story. You come right out of the genealogies of chapters 4 and 5, and you're just ready for a narrative, so you hop right over the first few verses and into when Noah is introduced. But in those first few verses of chapter 6, there is some incredible material that will change the way you read the Bible forever. Hey everyone, before we get into the episode itself, I want to give two disclaimers here up front. The first is a warning for content. Just due to the nature of what this chapter is talking about, there will be discussion of some sexual violence throughout the episode as a whole. It's nothing that's going to be too explicit or graphic, but it just cannot be avoided because that is the nature of what these few verses are talking about. I try not to be too graphic in any way, but if you're in the habit of listening to these with young children, this might not be the best episode for them. I'll leave that up to your judgment. Second disclaimer is that in this episode, I talk a lot about different translations of the Bible, and I call out certain translation choices that weren't necessarily the best. And I know it can be easy when people hear that to feel discouraged about the Bible translation that they have. But the last thing that I ever want to do is to break down someone's trust in the Bible translation that they use. The vast majority of Bible translations in English available on the market today are good and reliable, accurate translations of God's Word. You do not need to know Greek or Hebrew to be able to confidently say that you are reading the Bible. That being said, the Bible was not written in English, and as such, every English translation that you read is just that. It is a translation, and translations are human works. The majority of the English ones that we have are good and reliable. But because they are made by humans, there are some times when different translation choices could have been made that different people think would be better, particularly once theology gets involved. Translation does not just involve knowing two languages well. You also have to understand the content well. And a lot of translation committees focus on people who are very skilled in the languages, which is extremely important. But then you run into some cases where they're not necessarily biblical theologians, and so the biblical theologians might catch on to nuances in the story or in the grammar that someone who just knows the languages well might not catch. And because of that, the translation choice that they make might be accurate grammatically, but reflect something a little bit different theologically than what might have been intended in the passage. We have to consider both grammar and theology when doing a translation. So there are certain times that I call out what I think weren't the best translation choices. And when I do that, my aim is not to tear down any Bible translation or any translation committee. If anything, I actually want to build those up. I think there is too much in Christian circles where people look down on one Bible version or another or put up one over all of the rest. If anything, I want to bring confidence in your understanding of Scripture. But in order to do that, I have to be honest about places where I think that a better choice could have been made. So when you hear me make those comments in this episode or any others, realize that I am not trying to tear down the Bible or your Bible translation of choice, but rather just to say these are still human translations of a divine work. So we have to be honest when there was more than one good translation choice for a particular passage. So when you hear me make a comment like that, use that knowledge that you now have to dive into Bible study deeper. Get a couple of other Bible translations, use them side by side, use a parallel Bible, or like what I do is I use Logos Bible software, and I use their text comparison tool that lets me compare several different translations at a time. In fact, I tend to look at over a dozen at one time side by side. That can really help you to see areas where translation committees have differed and where there are some different possibilities for translation choices. Or, as the Bible itself says, in the multitude of counselors, there is wisdom and there is safety. Just wanted to throw that out there today as a reminder. Alright, let's get into the episode. Okay, talking about the gods of the Bible. And yes, we are still doing our Genesis 1 through 6 series. As I'll explain a little bit later on, this ties in all with the very beginning of Genesis 6, so that's why we're doing an entire episode today, just to talk about this divine realm in the ancient mindset of these writers, what they would have been imagining when they talked about gods in Bible times. Now, if you grew up anything like me, or if your time in church was anything like mine, you heard occasionally about other gods in the Bible, maybe about Baal, or we'd often say Baal in English, or I think of Diana or Artemis in that instance in Acts. Maybe you even heard someone try to connect the plagues from Exodus to specific gods from Egypt. But beyond that, most of the time any discussion of the gods was saying that they were just personifications of dead, lifeless idols. There was nothing to them. An idol is not real. The god behind it is not real. There is only one God, and he's basically the only tier of that spiritual being. You know, you might have angels and demons, but there's only one God. There is nothing else like that. The problem is that is not the mentality that the vast majority of humans would have had throughout all of human history. The majority of human civilizations have been polytheistic. They have believed in the existence of multiple gods, and many of them have worshipped multiple gods. Now, we tend to think of Christianity and Islam and Judaism as being monotheistic religions, believing only in one God. But that is not at all the picture that the Tanakh, the Old Testament, paints. The ancient Israelites were not monotheists. They were monolatrists. There's a difference. Monotheist means that you believe there is only one God. Monolatry means that you worship only one God. The ancient Jews were not monotheists. They were monolatrists. They believed in the existence of the gods all about them in the other nations. But they didn't worship them. They only worshipped Yahweh, but that does not mean that they didn't believe other gods existed. They knew other gods existed. It was just taken for granted. Now, if this is a new conversation to you, I realize that it can be extremely overwhelming, confusing, worrying, and 100 other things all at once. So let me take you to ground zero for this discussion. It usually begins at a psalm of all places. And it's Psalm 82. This is the kind of psalm that can easily be overlooked, but it packs quite the punch. Psalm 82 is titled as a psalm of Asaph, and it begins, God stands in the congregation of the mighty. He judges among the gods. How long will you judge unjustly, and accept the persons of the wicked? Selah. Defend the poor and the fatherless. Do justice to the afflicted and the needy. Deliver the poor and the needy. Rid them of the hand of the wicked. They know not, neither will they understand. They walk on in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are out of course. I have said, you are gods, and all of you children of the Most High, but you will fall like men, and fall like one of the princes. Arise, O God, judge the earth, for you will inherit all nations. Okay, so the idea of this psalm is that Yahweh is standing in a divine council of other supernatural beings, other small g gods. Not that they have the same power or authority as him. That's not what that means. But they are supernatural beings. I think that I discussed this previously. The word God is not a name. We tend to use it as such. We worship God as if that's his name. It's not. In the Bible, his name is Yahweh. God is a title. It is a class of supernatural beings. It basically just means supernatural beings. So, like we would use the term supernatural beings and say God is a supernatural being, angels are supernatural beings, demons are supernatural beings. But that doesn't mean they're all on the same plane. Same thing with the word God in Scripture. Things that are not the one true God, Yahweh, can still be called gods. Sometimes that is true of other supernatural type beings like angels. It's even true of the deceased. I wasn't planning on getting into this, but let's do it. 1 Samuel 28 is a really weird story. King Saul is coming to the end of his reign. He is extremely paranoid at this point. He has been spending quite a bit of time, effort, and money trying to chase down the fugitive David because he is afraid of his taking over the kingdom. Of course, we already know that God has anointed David and is going to have him as the next king after Saul's death. But Saul is just going crazy trying to find him. This is only a very short while before his death at the hands of the Philistines. But Saul goes ahead and he is really stressing out because Samuel, who had been the prophet who had anointed him, he had been his go-between for him and Yahweh, Samuel had died. And Saul was not hearing anything from God. None of the priests were helping him out. He couldn't get a word from God at all, and he was really scared that the Philistines were going to wipe out his army. So he goes to this witch. Some translations will call her a medium, a fortune teller, psychic, whatever it is. She was some sort of a diviner, someone who had a connection to the spiritual realm more than most other people do. I know some people will look at this passage and say that she was just faking it, but what she does actually works, because he goes to her and says, "Bring up Samuel. I want to talk to Samuel," even though he had died. So she goes ahead, and this is 1 Samuel 28, verse 11. The woman says to Saul, "Who would you have me bring up?" And he says, "Bring up Samuel." When the woman saw Samuel, she cried with a loud voice, and the woman spoke to Saul, saying, "Why have you deceived me? You're Saul." He had hidden his identity from her. And the king says to her, "Don't be afraid. What did you see?" And the woman said to Saul, "I saw gods ascending out of the earth." And he said, "What form is he of?" Now catch this. She says, "I have seen gods." And Saul goes, "Okay, what did he look like?" So the spirit of Samuel that is described here, and the Bible makes pretty clear, this was actually the spirit of Samuel. Now, how exactly that happened, why exactly that happened, no clue. That is another discussion for another day. It is a really freaky passage when you actually sit with the implications of it. But I bring this up to say that the spirit of the deceased Samuel is called an Elohim, a god. That does not mean that he is on par with Yahweh or that he is now, some sort of supernatural god. But it's just saying that he is a spirit being. He is no longer in the physical realm. So this word God, Elohim, in the Bible is not a name. It is a title. It is a class that refers to non-physical entities. And according to the Bible, there are lots of them, and Yahweh has set them up to have different levels of ruling authority over his creation. Basically, he delegates to them. And people might go, well, why would he do that? God doesn't need that. Well, you're right. But by the same token, then, why would he create humans and invite them to rule and reign over creation with him? See, God doesn't need anything necessarily, but he chooses to create and to delegate because he wants the relationships. And he wants to give people the opportunity to do something meaningful. And it's the same thing in the spiritual realm. So if it makes sense for us, it makes sense for them as well. So going back to Psalm 82, God stands in the congregation, and some translations here are going to say something along the lines of the mighty. This follows in the Old King James translation vein. And that really upsets me, because especially for translations that are trying to be very formal, word-for-word translations like the King James, that is a major interpretive leap. It's actually the word God. God stands in the congregation in the assembly of the gods, or of God. God stands in the assembly of God, and he judges among the gods. It's yet again the word Elohim. So he has this divine throne room, this divine courtroom, if you will, where he is judging over the gods, over these other spiritual beings that he has placed in authority over his creation. And you go, what is he judging him for? Well, that's verses 3 through 7, where he's saying, you were supposed to defend the poor and the fatherless. You were supposed to do justice in the earth. But instead, you have actually perverted that. You have done the opposite. You're gods, but verse 7 says you are going to die like humans, and you're going to fall like the princes. And then verse 8 is the psalmist speaking directly to God and challenging him to judge not just over the gods, but over the entire earth, because you will inherit all nations. That sounds really weird to us, but the picture that's being portrayed is that over different people groups, God appointed different spiritual beings, different gods, to lead them, to rule them, to bring them forward in human history. But one by one, those gods became corrupt. They liked the worship of those people more than directing them to Yahweh. So God is actually judging them for misusing their authority over the nations. And he's saying, it is now time for me to call you onto account and to say, you messed up here. You were supposed to rule these nations rightly, and instead you have actually abused your power. So I am going to inherit all of the nations. I am going to be the one to once again rule over all of the nations. Now this should bring up a big question in your mind. When did God appoint other gods to rule over nations, and why? How in the world did this happen? What is the psalmist referring to here? Well, that's where we need to go to Deuteronomy 32. This is the kind of passage that can very easily be overlooked. In fact, if you are not familiar with the work of Michael Heiser, you may not even be aware of this verse at all. I've never really heard it preached otherwise. Deuteronomy 32 is Moses' farewell speech to the people. He is at the end of his life. He's at the end of his work leading the children of Israel. He is going to die. And so he gives them this farewell speech, and he's recounting their history from the very beginning, from creation all the way up to where they are now, getting ready to go into the land of Canaan. In Deuteronomy 32, verse 8, he says, "When the Most High divided to the nations their inheritance, when he separated the sons of Adam, he set the bounds of the people according to the number of the children of Israel, because Yahweh's portion is his people. Jacob is the lot of his inheritance." What is Moses referring to here when he says that God divided up the nations and separated the sons of Adam? Well, there's only one time that this happens in the entire Bible story, so there's pretty much universal agreement about what this verse is referring to. And that's the Tower of Babylon incident in Genesis 11. We haven't gotten there yet. That will actually be in our next series. The current series we're in is Genesis 1 through 6, and then we're going to do one from 7 to 11 talking about Noah to Abraham. So we'll get to Genesis 11, probably be a few months before we get there, but we will get there eventually. A lot of people call it the Tower of Babel, but it's actually the word for Babylon, so I'll explain all that when we get to chapter 11. But it is the Tower of Babylon, and that is where humanity is trying to build this tower up into the heavens, and God comes down, stops their work, confuses all of their languages, splits them up, and people go all of their separate ways. That is the only time in the biblical story where God divides up humanity. So that is what this is talking about. So this is a commentary on what happens in Genesis 11. And so Moses says, when the Most High, that is God, that is Yahweh, divided to the nations their inheritance. So he's splitting them up. He's saying, you're going to go this way, you're going to go that way. These people are going out this way, so forth and so on. When he separated the sons of Adam, humans, okay, all good so far, he set the bounds of the people according to the number of the children of Israel. Now, I need you to put your thinking caps on here with me for a second, because this doesn't make sense. And depending on which translation you're using, you may have a different phrasing here. A number of translations, particularly older ones or ones based in the King James tradition, will say the number of the children of Israel. There's a problem with that, though. Israel didn't exist yet. The Tower of Babylon story in chapter 11 comes before the calling of Abraham story in chapter 12, and there is no Israel until there's Abraham. In fact, Israel as a nation doesn't even really begin until several generations later, and you have to go down a few generations for Jacob when he is renamed Israel as well. So this is quite a ways after the Tower of Babylon. And the number of the children of Israel was actually 12, whereas we'll get into this a little bit later on and in other discussions. But all of the people groups listed out in Genesis 10 and 11, what's called the Table of Nations, is 70. And there were only 12 children of Israel. Now, some people will look at the number of Israelites who left Canaan to go into Egypt at the time of Joseph between the end of Genesis and Exodus, and they'll say, well, there's 70 there, or roughly 72, or the number actually changes depending on which passage you're looking at and which version you're using. That is yet another discussion for another day. But there's roughly 70. So they'll say, well, maybe it was that. And maybe, but again, that happens around chapter 49-ish, somewhere around there in Genesis. 47 to 50 is kind of when Joseph's family moves down to Egypt. So we're talking about the difference between Genesis 11 and Genesis 47-ish. That is several generations there. So it just doesn't make sense to say that God divided up all of humanity according to the number of a nation that didn't even exist at this point. But some other translations will say something along the lines of the sons of God. That God divided up the nations according to the number of the sons of God. Now, sons or children, that's the same word either way. It's b'nai in Hebrew. So, sons or children, same thing. The real issue comes down to whether this is Israel or God. I've already brought up why Israel doesn't make a ton of sense there. Sons of God makes a lot more sense, though. For God to set the boundaries of the people according to the number of the sons of God. Now, when most people hear the phrase, son of God, they usually think of Jesus, because that's what he's often called. Maybe some people would even think of how Paul describes us as being children of God, or sons of God. But that's not the way that the phrase is used in the Old Testament, the Tanakh. It only shows up a few times in the Tanakh, but each time the phrase sons of God, or children of God, is referring to supernatural beings. Every single time. It is a way to refer to angelic-like creatures. They are called children of God because they were created by God and they are also gods, a small g in the sense of being supernatural, non-physical creatures. And this phrase does show up a few other times, so let's look at those really fast just to give you a feel for how this phrase, sons of God, or b'nai ha-Elohim in Hebrew, is used. They're pretty much all in either Job or Psalms. So Job 1, you may actually recognize this if you're familiar with the story of Job. It just probably didn't stand out to you as much before. But Job 1, verse 6, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before Yahweh, and the Satan also came among them. The role of the Satan, and why I say the Satan instead of Satan, is another discussion for another day. But just looking at the idea of the sons of God coming to God, it's very clearly supernatural beings. I don't know anyone who looks at this verse and thinks that these are humans who are somehow in the court of heaven coming up to God and giving account for what they are doing. Basically, everyone realizes these are supernatural beings who are reporting in to Yahweh to talk about what they have accomplished since their last meeting. This is the same thing that happens at the very beginning of chapter 2. Chapter 2, verse 1. Again, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before Yahweh, and the Satan came also among them to present himself before Yahweh. So again, very clearly, supernatural beings are these sons of God, these b'nai ha-Elohim. Once more, it shows up in Job 38:7. This is God's grilling Job on what it takes to rule the universe. And he's asking all these questions of, where were you when I created? And he just goes off on several different things. So verse 7 of chapter 38 says, when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. In other words, where were you when this happened? Well, this is talking about creation, when the morning stars sang together and the sons of God shouted for joy. And then he goes on to talk about shutting up the sea with the doors and thick darkness and bringing in sun and all this. So, this is creation language. This is Genesis 1 language. So there are no humans yet at this point. This is God separating light and dark, and he's saying that supernatural beings celebrated the very beginning of creation. So that is the sons of God. Morning stars is a reference to supernatural beings as well. So this is parallelism. When the morning stars sang together and the sons of God shouted for joy, the morning stars are being equated with the sons of God, supernatural beings. And now it's time for Rants with Colin, the part of the episode where Colin comes out and rants about something. Psalm 29:1. Give unto the Lord, O ye, and again, depending on which translation you have, like King James, I'm sorry to harp on this, but it really frustrates me that they went for this. It's a major interpretive choice that they put in mighty. They're coming in with the theological assumption that there is only one God that the Bible talks about, and so when they see the Hebrew word Elohim, and it's very clearly not talking about God, they just assume, well, it can't be talking about other gods, it must just be talking about really strong, mighty, powerful people. That is bringing a theological bias into your translation and changing what the Bible is trying to say. Now, it is a possibility. I want to be fair to them. But I don't think it fits the ancient context, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a second here. But we have to pause and acknowledge that the Hebrew word is for the gods. It's Elohim. Give to Yahweh, O ye b'nai Elohim, sons of God. Give to Yahweh, O you sons of God. Give to Yahweh glory and strength. It really does kind of bug me that they went ahead and just took the phrase that very clearly means sons of God and translated it to mean mighty. And even the English translations that were around before the King James got this right. They said sons of God. I think the Wycliffe did. The Geneva Bible said sons of the mighty, so at least they kept sons in there. But the King James just went and did its own thing, and it, for some reason, translated mighty for b'nai Elohim, sons of God. So this is one, depending on which version you're using, you may miss the fact that this is a sons of God instance in the Bible. But either way, it is talking about supernatural beings here. We have to go back to Psalm 82 for this next one. Psalm 82:6, when it says, I have said, you are gods, and all of you, children of the Most High. Now I realize this is not sons of God specifically. It's slightly different. Rather than B'nai Elohim, it is B'nai Elyon. So, sons of the Most High. But it's the same idea, whether it's talking about B'nai Elohim, sons of God, or B'nai Elyon, sons of the Most High. Same idea. And then a few psalms down, Psalm 89 verse 6, says, For who in the heaven can be compared to Yahweh? Who among the, and here we go again, sons of the mighty in some of these translations, but sons of Elohim, sons of God, is what it says. Who among the sons of God can be likened to Yahweh? And I also have to give an honorable mention to Daniel 3:25. This is not Hebrew, this is actually Aramaic. It's in one of the very few sections of the Tanakh that is written in Aramaic. And this is Nebuchadnezzar has thrown the 3 Hebrew youths into the burning fiery furnace, and he's talking to the guard there by the side, and he says, Look, I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, they have no hurt, and the form of the 4th is like the son of the gods. And here's another instance where translation bias can really get in the way. Some of these older ones, following the King James, have it capitalized as the 4th is like the son of God. And this is really reading back a Christian interpretation hundreds of years back into the story of Daniel. Son of God is a title that we use for Jesus, the second person of the Trinity. But that is Christian doctrine. That was not present here in Daniel chapter 3. Nebuchadnezzar would not have known about Jesus. He was not a Yahweh worshiper. He was not saying, oh, there's a 4th person in there who looks like the embodied Son of God, Jesus of Nazareth, who's going to come in several hundred years and take away the sins of the world. No, he's saying the 4th looks like a son of the gods. A supernatural being. The 4th is just some sort of generic, non-physical, spiritual being. This is a god that we're looking at. He was not a Yahweh worshiper. He would not have known who the Son of God was. That was a theological bias that slipped into some translations here. This is another instance. Now it's Aramaic, it's not Hebrew, so rather than B'nai Elohim, it is Bar Elohim. But same thing, same meaning of son of God that goes on here. So you can see from all of these instances, these are all of the times that the phrase sons of God shows up in the Tanakh. Every single one of these is talking about supernatural beings. So when we approach Genesis 6, and we're going to see the phrase sons of God show up, we have to consider the context of all of these other usages, and let that determine what it means here in this passage. It's going to really blow your mind when you read the passage, and you may read it in a way that you've never considered it before. Let's look at the first 6 verses here in Genesis 6, and then we'll cover the rest next week. It came to pass when humans began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of which they chose. And Yahweh said, My spirit will not always strive with humanity, because he is also flesh. His days will be 120 years. Now there were giants in the earth in those days, and after that. When the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown. And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And it repented Yahweh that he had made man, humans, on the earth, and grieved him at his heart. Okay, there is a ton that we have to talk about here. Verse 1, I want to point out that this is not happening in the time of Noah. I think a lot of people, when they read this, they assume it's talking about activity during the days of Noah, because, well, Noah shows up in the story actually right after where we stopped reading. But read verse 1 again. It came to pass when humans began to multiply on the face of the earth. Well, when was that? Long before Noah's day. In fact, Genesis 4 and 5 are full of stories of humanity multiplying over the face of the earth. So the events of these first few verses are not happening in Noah's lifetime. They are happening before his lifetime as humans are starting to spread. In fact, there is an apocryphal book that is not a part of the biblical canon, but it was written around the time of the Bible, and it adds in commentary to a lot of what happens at the beginning of Genesis, and it's called First Enoch. A lot of times it's just called the Book of Enoch, but there's actually a couple, so it's more technically First Enoch. And we'll get into some of First Enoch in a little bit here, because it's a really fascinating story that fleshes out the life of the biblical character of Enoch. the guy who got taken up into heaven that we talked about last week. So when you read First Enoch, what happens here in these few verses happens in the time of Enoch and Yared, who was in the genealogy in chapter 5, verse 18. So if that is the case, everything that's happening here is actually happening well before Noah would have been born. So worth keeping in mind just to keep our timeline clear. Alright, so verse 2, here's where it really starts to get interesting. The sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. Okay, after the discussion that we have had so far, can you see how this is a really, really weird verse? We've talked about what sons of God means in the Bible. They are supernatural, godlike beings that are considered to be very real and actually empowered by God to help him rule over the earth. So if that is the case, we have supernatural beings taking human wives here in this verse. That's what it says. The sons of God saw the daughters of men, and they took them wives of all which they chose. Now that sounds really weird to us. To our modern ears, the idea of gods coming down and marrying human women is a very strange concept, and it sounds mythical. It sounds fantastical, too weird and wonky to be true. And because of that, a lot of people throughout the centuries have been uncomfortable with that. They just have not been able to wrap their heads around the idea that the Bible could be saying supernatural beings, other gods, came down to earth and married human women. So there are actually three main interpretations that center on this passage. Three different ways that people look at it and try to understand what was happening. The first, and what I think is probably most common, what many of you have probably heard if you have ever heard this preached on, is that the sons of God were actually the godly line of Seth, and the daughters of men were from the fallen line of Cain. Now, that doesn't really work. It keeps everything nice and clean and human, so we don't have any of the weird supernatural stuff going on. But honestly, it really does not work in the text. For one thing, there is no other time in the Tanakh where the phrase sons of God refers to godly humans. It's just not there. That's not what it meant back then. So you are importing a different meaning into this passage because you are not comfortable with what the Bible is saying. That's not a good position to be in. It also doesn't fit because the phrase men there is the word ha'adam, human. So the sons of God, which we have already discussed, always means supernatural spiritual beings in the Tanakh, saw the daughters of humans. So if these sons of God are godly human bachelors from the line of Seth, why are the daughters described as daughters of humanity? That would be a given. Oh, of course they are. They're all humans there. But if you understand that this is talking about sons of God as spiritual beings, then calling them the daughters of humanity sets up the contrast between the spiritual beings and the physical beings, between the gods and the humans in this passage. There is also then no answer for why the giants show up in the next couple verses. There's no reason for giants to exist if these are just humans marrying each other. But if you take the idea that these are supernatural beings that intermarried with humans and created a mixed race of half human, half divine beings, then it makes sense that there are giants. And yes, I understand that is a really freaky, weird concept that opens up all other kinds of cans of worms. But it at least makes sense of the giants. And we'll get to the giants a little bit more in a minute here. So, personally, I do not consider the idea that the sons of God are the godly line of Seth to have any merit whatsoever. I do not think it is being honest to the culture of the Bible. Now, I realize many people hold to that view because that's just all they've ever been taught. But once you've been introduced to the alternative perspectives that you can have, I think it's wise to ditch the idea of the godly line of Seth as soon as possible. It just does not fit the passage at all. Other people have suggested that the sons of God could be kings. They are still fully human, but ancient cultures often deified their kings. They saw them as gods or even sometimes sons of gods. That's where we kind of got eventually to the idea of the divine right of kings over time. It started with a god came down and was our king. Then it was, well, maybe he put his son in place to rule over us. And then it became eventually, well, the gods just set up this human to rule over us. So kings in ancient times were sometimes considered to be sons of God. So I will at least give this view that it does have some cultural merit, I think it's more respectful to the context of the Bible than the line of Seth view. However, I don't think it holds up as well as the supernatural beings view that I'm presenting here. And even though I'm talking about this for quite a while today, I'm still only just barely scratching the surface. And this is something that takes a while. When you have not heard this before, it sounds wacky and hard to believe, and it takes a lot of study to realize that this is actually the culture of the Bible. So today, I am not expecting to settle this once and for all for you. What I'm just looking to do is to present you with information that you may never have heard before. And then you have to go and do the study and consideration yourself. And this is a topic that is going to continue to come up in future podcast episodes. Because once you start to see this in Genesis 6, it's like the key that unlocks the rest of the Bible. Because you start to see all of the times that the Bible talks about a supernatural realm and divine beings. It just completely changes the story for you. So I take the view that sons of God, as with every other passage in the Tanakh, sons of God here means divine beings, that these are small g gods who left their place in heaven to come to earth, marry human women, and they created a cursed half-human, half-divine race of beings that was giant in form. Now, lest you think that I am pulling this completely out of thin air and making it all up, I want to read you some passages from other ancient works that comment on this passage here in Genesis 6. And I want you to see the way that they describe what's happening here, and you'll see that this is not at all a new idea. In fact, from the documents that we have, the idea that the sons of God in this passage were supernatural beings is the oldest view. We have documents even a couple hundred years before Jesus that refer to this as supernatural beings coming down and marrying human women. It is not until a couple hundred years after Jesus that we start to see people describing this encounter as just entirely human, and they take the supernatural element out of it entirely. So let me read you some ancient Jewish texts that talk about this passage. So these are not biblical texts. You can find any of these relatively easily online, but these are the way that ancient Jews would have understood this when they read Genesis 6. This comes from the book of Jubilees, chapter 4, verse 15. And he called him Yared, because in his days the angels of Yahweh, who were called Watchers, came down to the earth in order to teach the sons of man, and perform judgment and uprightness upon the earth. So this book of Jubilees is saying that what happens here is happening in the days of Yared, and this is angels of God. They're called Watchers. That is a title that shows up in some other passages. It actually even shows up in Daniel, which is really fascinating. We don't have time to get into that today, but we will at some later point, because that's a really interesting term. So just realize that these sons of God are sometimes also called Watchers. And so Jubilees here says that they came down to teach humanity. Chapter 5 of Jubilees, verse 1. When the children of humans began to multiply on the surface of the earth, and daughters were born to them, the angels of Yahweh saw in a certain year of that Jubilee that they were good to look at. And they took wives for themselves from all those whom they chose. And they bore children for them, and they were the giants. See, I'm not making this up. This is a text that was likely finished over 100 years before Jesus was born. And it's talking about angels or supernatural beings coming to earth, cohabiting with human women. Chapter 7 of that same book, verses 21 and 22. For on account of these three, the flood came upon the earth. It was because of the fornication which the Watchers, apart from the mandate of their authority, fornicated with the daughters of humanity, and took for themselves wives from all which they chose, and made a beginning of impurity. And they begot sons, the Nephilim, and all of them were dissimilar, and each one ate his fellow. That's a very interesting addition there. There's another ancient work called the Testament of Reuben. Chapter 5, verses 5 and 6 of that reads, Accordingly, my children, flee from sexual promiscuity. Order your wives and your daughters not to adorn their heads and their appearances so as to deceive men's sound mind. For every woman who schemes in these ways is destined for eternal punishment. Wow, that's harsh. For it was thus that they charmed the Watchers who were before the flood. As they continued looking at the women, they were filled with desire for them and perpetrated the act in their minds. Then they were transformed into human males, and while the women were cohabiting with their husbands, they appeared to them. Since the women's minds were filled with lust for these apparitions... I'm sorry, this is actually just kind of amusing how whacked out it is as I'm reading this. But since the women's minds were filled with lust for these apparitions, they gave birth to giants, for the Watchers were disclosed to them as being high as the heavens. Now, obviously, the Testament of Reuben did not end up in the Bible, and that is a really, really weird account. But before you go off saying, oh, that's just so wacky, it can't even be true, like, you're talking about this guy telling women not to wear, basically, makeup and jewelry and fancy clothes because that's how they tempted supernatural beings? Like, what in the world, how whacked out can you get? Well, before you think that, let me just tell you that that's what the Apostle Paul thought, too. Seriously, as weird as that passage sounded, if you have ever read 1 Corinthians 11, you're actually already familiar with that view. Check out 1 Corinthians 11 verses 3 to 10. This is Paul writing to the Corinthian church, and listen to how similar this is to what we just read from the Testament of Reuben. And let me say before we get into this, there are all kinds of rabbit holes that are all throughout these few verses that I'm about to read. I am going to do my best to sidestep them, because that is not our conversation for today. I realize as I'm reading this is a major problem passage. There is all kinds of debate, all kinds of issues that can come up from this passage, so bear with me. 1 Corinthians 11 is not our topic of study today. I realize that I am pulling the pin on several grenades, dropping them, and then running the opposite direction. We'll have to bear with that for today, just to stay on topic. So, 1 Corinthians 11, starting in verse 3. I would have you know that the head of every man is Christ. The head of the woman is the man, and the head of Christ is God. Every man praying or prophesying, having his head covered, dishonors his head. But every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, for that is even all one as if she were shaven. Now remember, rabbit holes, sidestepping them. Verse 6. For if the woman be not covered, let her also be shorn. But if it be a shame for a woman to be shorn or shaven, let her be covered. For a man indeed ought not cover his head, forasmuch as he is the image and glory of God. But the woman is the glory of man. Rabbit holes, walking around them. Verse 8. For the man is not of the woman, but the woman of the man. Neither was the man created for the woman, but the woman for the man. Here we go. For this cause ought the woman to have power on her head, because of the angels. I guarantee you have never heard a preacher mention that from the pulpit. Why? Because it's weird. That is very, very strange. And what's happening here is Paul is drawing on Jewish tradition, like we read in the Testament of Reuben, that said that the reason these sons of God, these angels, these watchers fell in chapter 6 is because they were lusting over beautiful human women. And again, I can't get into all of this today, but in order to understand this passage, I'll just throw this teaser out. In order to understand it, you have to realize that in ancient Greco-Roman time, a lot of the people considered a woman's hair to be a part of her reproductive system. It was actually believed that a man's testicles kept his sperm from going further up into his body. They acted as weights, keeping the sperm in the center of his body. And a woman's hair then actually worked during sexual intercourse to draw up the man's sperm out of his body and into hers. So it acted like a counterbalance to his testicles, drawing the sperm into her body. So hair was considered to be a sexual thing in that culture. It is very weird, and that brings up all kinds of questions of why a divinely inspired book was using such really bad science. That was just the consensus of the day. So realize that when you're reading that kind of thing, Paul is drawing on the scientific understanding of the day and also on a lot of Jewish culture. So I realize a ton of rabbit holes that we could have gone down there, and I opened up every single can of worms possible and didn't do anything with them. But I just wanted to show you that this is not just weird text that didn't end up in the Bible. This is actually the mindset of the Bible itself. In fact, it's even in a couple other passages that you may not have realized. Jude, verse 6. Now, Jude only has one chapter, so we just go by verses. Jude 6, the angels which kept not their first estate, but left their own habitation, he, meaning God, has reserved in everlasting chains under darkness until the judgment of that great day. So Jude comes right out and says that the rebellion was of sky rulers who weren't content with their allotment to rule. They wanted what the humans had, so they came down and tried to corrupt the humans' bloodline. And Jude and Paul are not alone. It also shows up in 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 4 and 5. For if God spared not the angels that sinned, but cast them down to hell, and that is not actually the word for hell, that is the word Tartarus, which is really a very interesting different study that we have to sidestep here. But Peter is saying that God sent these fallen angels into a Greek mythological supernatural prison that was called Tartarus, So he says that God sent these beings to this Greek myth prison, this Greek Alcatraz, somewhere in the cosmos, and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved unto judgment. He spared not the old world, but saved Noah, the eighth person, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood upon the world of the ungodly. So both of these make pretty clear this is talking about Genesis 6. It is in connection to the Noah story. So again, this isn't just weird ancient text that didn't end up in the Bible. It's just in the air, in the water of the culture of this time. This is the same air that the biblical writers were breathing. Like, they understood this. This is what they grew up with. These are the stories that they heard, and it influenced their writings. It also shows up, going back to some other ancient writings, in something called the Testament of Naphtali, chapter 3, verse 5. Likewise, the watchers departed from nature's order. The Lord pronounced a curse on them at the flood. On their account, he ordered that the earth be without dweller or produce. So this is blaming the flood on the transgression of these watchers. 2 Baruch, chapter 56, verses 12 and 15. And some of them came down and mingled themselves with women. At that time, they who acted like this were tormented in chains. So you can see where Jude and Peter are getting it. But the rest of the multitude of angels who have no number restrained themselves. And those living on earth perished together through the waters of the flood. It's even in Philo, in his work called On the Giants. When the angels of God saw the daughters of men that they were beautiful, they took unto themselves wives of all of them whom they chose. Those beings, whom other philosophers call demons, that's an interesting development there, Moses usually calls angels, and they are souls hovering in the air. Wow, that's an interesting one. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, there was a work called the Genesis Apocryphon. And it reads, Behold then, I thought in my heart that the conception was the work of the watchers, and the pregnancy of the holy ones, and it belonged to the Nephilim. So again, attributing this to supernatural beings, and attributing the Nephilim to being the offspring of the watchers. I realize I'm kind of being a dead horse here, but I'm guessing none of these are quotes that you have ever heard before in your life, and definitely not in church. So I'm just trying to give you this information to understand the culture of the time. I'll give you another one here. The Dead Sea Scrolls have another one called the Damascus Document. And don't allow yourself to be attracted by the thoughts of a guilty inclination and lascivious eyes. For many have gone astray due to these. Brave heroes stumbled on account of them, from ancient times until now. For having walked in the stubbornness of their hearts, the watchers of heaven fell. On account of it they were caught, for they did not heed the precepts of God. And their sons, whose height was like that of the cedars, and their bodies like mountains, fell. You get in the idea that this was just the assumption of the time, that these were supernatural, divine beings. I've mentioned a few times now the book of 1st Enoch, and I want to take a few minutes and read, it's a little bit of a larger section from this, but I think you'll find it interesting because it's basically a commentary on what happens here in Genesis 6. So here's 1st Enoch. Again, this is something you can very easily find online, and starting in chapter 6. The chapters are very short in 1st Enoch most of the time. Chapter 6 of 1st Enoch reads, And it came to pass, when the children of men had multiplied, that in those days were born unto them beautiful and comely daughters. And the angels, the children of heaven, saw and lusted after them, and said to one another, Come, let us choose us wives from among the children of men, and beget us children. And Semjaza, who was their leader, said unto them, I fear you will not indeed agree to do this deed, and I alone shall have to pay the penalty of a great deed. And they all answered him and said, Let us swear an oath, and all bind ourselves by mutual imprecations, not to abandon this plan, but to do the thing. Then they sware all together, and bound themselves by mutual imprecations upon it. And they were all, in all, 200, who descended in the days of Yared on the summit of Mount Hermon, and they called it Mount Hermon, because they had sworn and bound themselves by mutual imprecations upon it. And these are the names of their leaders. And it goes on to name the supernatural beings that were captains of these 200 that came down from heaven to intermarry with human women. And the names are pretty fun here. There's Samlazaz, Arkalba, Ramil, Kabaleel, Tamleel, Ramlel, Danel, Ezekiel, and it keeps going on. I won't try to pronounce all of them. Next chapter says, All of the others together with them took to themselves wives, and each chose for himself one, and they began to go in unto them and to defile themselves with them. And they taught them charms and enchantments, the cutting of roots, and made them acquainted with plants. And they became pregnant, and they bare great giants whose height was 3,000 ells, who consumed all the acquisitions of men. And when men could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against them and devoured mankind. They began to sin against birds and beasts and reptiles and fish, to devour one another's flesh and drink the blood. Then the earth laid accusation against the lawless ones. and Azazel, he was one of the watchers that fell. Azazel taught men to make swords. Now that's interesting. Remember the discussion of the sword as an angelic weapon that we talked about in the very end of chapter 3? This has a fallen divine creature teaching humanity how to make swords. Interesting. He taught them to make swords and knives and shields and breastplates, and made known to them the metals of the earth, and the art of working them, and bracelets and ornaments, and the use of antimony, and the beautifying of the eyelids, and all the kinds of costly stones, and all coloring tinctures. And there arose much godlessness, and they committed fornication. They were led astray and became corrupt in their ways. Semjaza, another of the watchers, taught enchantments and root cuttings. Armaros, the resolving of enchantments. Barakiel taught astrology. Kokabel taught them the constellations. Ezekiel, the knowledge of the clouds. Arakiel, the signs of the earth. Shamsiel, the signs of the sun. Sariel, the course of the moon. And as men perished, they cried, and their cry went up to heaven. And I'll stop there. It continues on for a while. But this is a very prominent ancient Jewish work that is saying that these watchers, when they came down, intermarried with human women, and had these weird half-human, half-divine race of offspring called the Nephilim, they started to teach humans knowledge that they wouldn't have had otherwise. So it sounds like some of this metallurgy, some of this astrology, was stuff that was only supposed to be known by supernatural beings. And yet these supernatural beings are sharing their trade secrets with humanity, telling them things that they would never have known otherwise. Really, really fascinating. And this is the kind of thing that was in the minds of the biblical authors. This is what they would have assumed when they were reading these stories. So even though it sounds really weird, really foreign to us, it was just the culture of the time. Going back in verse 2, the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair. Now that word fair is the Hebrew word tov, which we know from previous stories as being the word for good. That's significant because in Genesis 3, a woman saw what she thought was good and took of it for herself and caused all kinds of problems for humanity. Now, a woman is the thing that is being seen as good and taken. So the sons of God are actually objectifying the daughters of humans. They're looking down, seeing that they look good in their eyes, and then taking them for themselves. So this is like a flip of what happened in Genesis 3. There you had a woman at the behest of a supernatural being, seeing something as good and taking it, even though God said not to. And now you have a supernatural being seeing a woman as something that is good and to be taken for themselves. I think they're also following in Lamech's footsteps, the bad Lamech from Cain's line, where he took the wives to himself. And again, that can just be a normal Hebrew way of saying that they got married, they took women. But it is still a forceful word that I think could even, in some ways, imply rape, or at least very violent sexual behavior. In fact, when we get to verse 4, it says that the sons of God came into the daughters of men. Robert Alter has noted in his translation commentary that the Hebrew idiom is literally come into, or entered into. It involves a more direct reference to the mechanics of the sexual act than to know, the word that's usually used, and thus has a more carnal coloration. The English word entered would be too clinical. And in any case, the Hebrew idiom refers to the whole act of intercourse, not merely to penetration. Of the three expressions used for sexual intercourse in Genesis, the other two being to know and to lie with, this one is reserved for sexual intimacy with a woman with whom the man has not previously had carnal relations, whether or not she is his legitimate wife. The spatial imagery of the idiom coming into appears to envision entering concentric circles, the woman's private sphere, her bed, and her body. So taking what Robert Alter is saying and even going a little bit further, I think that the language that is used here is implying that this was a forceful sexual union, and that it was essentially rape. These supernatural beings were grabbing these human women for themselves and essentially enslaving them as their own concubines or sex slaves. And the Bible stops short of ever specifically saying that the giants or the Nephilim are the offspring of this union. It never clearly says that. If you look in verse 4, it just says there were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men and they bare children to them, the same became mighty men of old, men of renown. But if you're reading a translation that italicizes the words, you might see that if it says bear children, children is actually italicized. It just literally reads they bear to them. So I think the text is implying very strongly that these giants were the offspring of the divine sons of God and the human women. Now, that leads us to talk about these giants. What were they? In Hebrew, the word is Nephilim. You may or may not have ever heard that word before. And if you have heard it before, chances are it's been in a not very biblical context. Nephilim is just the Hebrew word, and a lot of people think that it comes from the root word nephal, which in Hebrew would mean fallen ones. That is possible, but some other work has been done, and I'll put a link to this in the show notes. But certain scholars think that that was very unlikely, and that it was just a word that in and of itself meant giants. Either way, I think there is a little bit of a play on the Hebrew root nephal, but yeah, the word more than likely just means giants. The concept of having a sexual union between a divine being and a human woman, leading to a half-human, half-divine offspring that was of extremely large size and often quite powerful, was extremely common in all different kinds of cultures across the world. In fact, if you think of the demigods of Greek and Roman mythology, people like Hercules or Achilles, that's this kind of being. A semi-divine human who came from intermarriage of a human woman and a divine father. Or for any of you Moana fans out there, Maui, remember the song, Just an Ordinary Demigod? It's across all of these different cultures. When you have someone who's not quite God, not quite human, they often have supernatural powers, and their superhuman lives were usually recounted in mythologies of the cultures. And that's even reflected here in the text, where in verse 4 it says that they became mighty men, which were of old men of renown. Now, mighty men is in Hebrew the word gibborim, and it can just mean strong men. It is often used of a nation's warriors in the Bible. But there's kind of a negative context that it can have related to this passage, where the Nephilim are associated with Gibborim as being very strong warriors. They are specifically called, what some translations will say is men of renown. It's literally in Hebrew, men of the name. In other words, their name was just so great, their fame was spread abroad throughout the entire culture. And the idea of having a name that outlives you becomes very significant a little bit later on in the story when we get to the Tower of Babylon. So that's actually a really important phrase that's mentioned here with these Gibborim and Nephilim. So these half-human, half-divine creatures that many ancient cultures considered to be the heroes of their mythologies, in the biblical story, they're actually the offspring of fallen angels. So it's like the Bible is turning the mythology of other cultures on its head and saying that these people that you idolize are actually not so great. They are the reason why the world was so messed up that we needed a flood. It gets so bad that in verse 5, God saw the wickedness of humanity was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thought of his heart was only evil continually. I want to touch on this for a second, because there is a difference between total depravity and pervasive depravity. There's a very common theology term, especially in Reformed Calvinistic circles, that is called total depravity. And it's basically the idea that humanity without God is totally depraved. There is nothing good that they can do. Everything is just sinful and wrong and evil and corrupt in every possible way. A lot of good Christians believe that. And I can understand why, looking at certain Bible passages, you could be led to think that. Even something like this can look like that. But I don't believe that the Bible actually teaches total depravity. If anything, I think that the Bible actually teaches common grace, that apart from God, people can do good. A person does not need to be a Christian in order to do some good in the world. There are plenty of atheistic doctors who help people every day. There's plenty of Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus, fill in the blank, who do all kinds of good in their fields every day, or just help their fellow humans. So you do not have to be a Christian in order to do something good. God recognizes when somebody does a good thing in the world. So I don't think that this verse is teaching total depravity, even in the world at that time. I think it's saying that there was pervasive depravity. See, the language here is cosmic. It's using these big, all-inclusive, expansive words, and the same kind of description that's going to be used of the flood, to say that all of life was wiped out and all this. But that's very common in the Bible, to use this cosmic decreation, literally like the world is ending kind of language, when actually it's not quite that big. It's very hyperbolic. You can compare this to the language used during the plagues in Egypt. Like in Exodus 7, The Bible says that all of the water in all of the land had turned to blood. But then just a few verses later, it says that the Egyptians were able to dig and find water. Okay, well, if all of the water turned to blood, that includes the water that's underground as well, so which is it? But it's not a contradiction, it's the Bible using hyperbolic language. It happens all the time. In Joshua's conquest, in the book of Joshua, it sounds like he is killing everyone. You get story after story of them wiping out, not just the men, but the women and the children and the animals. But then by the end of the book, he's only gotten about half of the land driven out. So you have this pervasive language, but not actually the results being quite that big. And even with the flood that we're going to talk about next week, it is very cosmic decreation language. It's made to sound like this thing covers the entire world. We'll discuss that may or may not have actually been the case. But it's made to sound like the whole thing is gone, and yet we have things and people in the Bible that existed before the flood that show up again after the flood. For instance, in chapter 4 of Genesis, we had the genealogy of Cain, and it talked about this guy was the father of musicians, this guy was the father of the nomadic people who lived in the tents, so forth and so on. And it just tells us about these different innovations in humanity. Why would it tell us that if all of that's going to be wiped out in the flood? Now, I realize you could say, well, maybe Noah knew some of that. But are you really going to say that Noah knew all about nomadic herding? Did he know everything about music? Did he know everything about metallurgy? All of these different areas. He can only be skilled in so many things. So how did this knowledge continue? Did he bring a bunch of books on? And why would these people be called the father of all who dwell in tents, the father of all who play the harp, or whatever instrument it was that mentioned there, if that all has to start again after Noah? You get it here with the Nephilim. The giants were in the earth in those days, and also after that. Some of you may have already started to think about this. If all life gets wiped out at the flood, aside from those who are in the ark, and you have these Nephilim, these giants that are before the flood, how do you get giants after the flood? And there are, all throughout. Joshua even showing up a bit in Judges and in the time of David in 1st and 2nd Samuel. There are Nephilim. There are giants again. So what happened? Did they survive the flood? Did they start again? The Bible just says, in those days and also after that. So was there a second fall of angels that happened after the flood? Well, the Bible doesn't record that, and I kind of feel like that would be a really big deal. Like, if this was such a major thing that it's talked about even in Jude, even in 2 Peter, even in 1 Corinthians, if it happened a second time, it would be brought up again. But it's not. There's no indication in the text that angels fell a second time. So how do you get a new bunch of Nephilim? Unless they weren't entirely wiped out at the flood. You get it as well with a group called the Cainites. The descendants of Cain were called the Cainites. Well, if all of the descendants of Cain were wiped out at the flood, how do you get Cainites showing up again later on, which you do? Some people say, well, maybe they just named themselves after a different guy named Cain. Well, maybe, but that's a bit coincidental. Others would say, well, maybe they just took on the name of Cain. Again, why? The Bible just has these oddities that are thrown in of things that existed before the flood, and then that just mysteriously show up again after. And there's no real explanation for it. So it's another example of where you have this pervasive, all-encompassing language of something that just sounds cosmic and like it's completely destroying the entire world, when really maybe it was actually something a little bit more local. And so that's what you have here when it's talking about the thoughts and the intentions of everybody's heart being corrupt at all times. That word continually there at the end is all of his days. So in other words, as long as a human was alive, every devising of the thoughts of his heart was always evil. It's this very hyperbolic language. It's not saying that nobody ever had a good, righteous, holy, nice thought about another person. It's not saying that literally every single person who lived and breathed only ever thought about evil things. It's just a hyperbolic way to describe how evil the time was then. Robert Alter again has pointed out that in verse 5, where you have every imagination of the thought of his heart, or the devising of his heart, Alter says, in the Bible, the heart is usually thought of as the seat of intelligence, only occasionally as the seat of emotion. Thus, many modern translators use the word mind here. But man's evil heart is pointedly meant to stand in contrast to God's grieving heart, the same Hebrew word that is used in the next verse. In verse 6 we read, "It repented Yahweh that he made man on the earth, it grieved him at his heart." So there's a contrast that's set here between the evilness that exists in the thinking of humans and the grief that exists in the thoughts and emotions of God. And we'll get into God's response more next week, but I just want to point out that this is actually the first emotion of God ever recorded in Scripture. And despite everything that we just talked about, it's not anger. So many people assume that God was just so ticked off that he needed to wipe out all of humanity with a flood. And we'll get to some stories next week from other ancient cultures that actually do talk about the gods just being so ticked off they wiped out humanity in a flood. But that's not the story of the Bible. God isn't angry with humans. He doesn't wipe them out in anger. He's sad. In fact, anger doesn't show up anywhere in the flood narrative. Not a single place. God's anger doesn't even show up at all until Exodus. It's nowhere in Genesis. And even in Exodus, it only shows up 3 times. Once against Moses, once against Pharaoh, which is the only time he acts on his anger, and once against his new covenant people. And that's a different study for a different day of what those actually imply when he's angry. But I find it fascinating that in this entire story, there is no mention of God's anger. We so often think of a vengeful, wrathful, angry God of the Old Testament, but that is not the depiction that is here in this story. Rather, we have a God who loves humanity and who was wishing that they would have made better choices in their life. Next week, we'll get more into God's reaction and what all that means. Whew, okay, how are we feeling? We covered quite a bit here this week, and I realize a lot of it was probably pretty new to you, something that you have not heard before in church, and that's okay. There is a first time that all of us have heard this before, and there is no pressure to accept any one particular way of viewing the Bible. My job here is not to convince you to believe what I believe, it's just to give you the kind of information that you would not normally hear in church or in a Sunday school class, and then you can take that, study it, do your own research, and come to your own conclusions with that. I do want to give one little word of advice here. If you end up studying anything on the Nephilim, be careful what you read online. There are basically 2 kinds of material that you'll find on Nephilim. One is good scholarly material that honestly didn't really exist 20 years ago. 20 years ago, if you were looking for something on the Nephilim, it was basically just going to be all wacky, weird stuff. But thanks to mainly the work of Michael Heiser, this has become a topic that is more seriously considered by biblical scholars who weren't familiar with it before. So if you're looking for anything on the Nephilim, the sons of God, Genesis 6, Deuteronomy 32, Psalm 82 that we talked about, look up Mike Heiser. He has done all kinds of articles, podcasts, YouTube videos. He's written books on this, The Unseen Realm, books on angels and demons, and also Reversing Herman gets into a lot of this, and the Book of Enoch as well. So I'd recommend, if you're interested in that kind of thing, check out the work of Mike Heiser. That is going to be the best scholarly stuff that you can find. He does a fantastic job of footnoting his research as well, so you can always double check and see where he's getting his ideas. However, there are other things that you can find online that aren't quite as reputable. And this is mostly going to be on older internet chat sites and forums where you have people talking about Nephilim as if they still exist today, and talking about corrupted bloodlines of humans. It gets into all kinds of really weird, wacky stuff. So if you start to see people talk about Nephilim and it just really feels off to you, not in the this is new and curious kind of way, but in the that just doesn't seem to fit the Bible kind of way, there's probably a red flag coming up in your mind for a reason. So be sure to check anything you hear on that with good biblical scholarship like Heiser, who has documented his work with other ancient cultures of the time. I just wanted to throw that out there because it is possible to do some of that study and get into some really wacky territory really fast, and then you're not quite sure what happened. Happy studies with all of that. I will post as much of these resources as I can to our show notes. I update those frequently. So even if we recorded an episode weeks or months or maybe eventually even years ago, and I come across a new resource that talks about what we said in that episode, I go back and I add that in. So I'm constantly revising and updating the information that we have on our sites. Every podcast episode we have has a blog post article. That's just the best way to put it out there, was to have a page dedicated to each episode. So you can go on our website under the blog section. You can filter just specifically for the episodes, and every single one of those has show notes. Most of them are going to have recommended resources that I put up there. And this episode in particular, I will be sure to put up a bunch of recommended resources of reading and watching that you can do for this topic. So I hope that is a help to you. And again, feel free at any time to send in questions via our website. There's a question section on the bottom of the homepage, and that just sends them right to ccon@thebibleuncut.com. You can email them directly that way as well. That's cconn@thebibleuncut.com. And we'd love to hear from you. And you can even post in our socials when we put up that we have an episode. You can respond to that with questions or thoughts or feedback you have on the episode, and we'll do our best to check those out and respond as we can. Okay, next week we are finishing up chapter 6. We're going to get into Noah. We're going to talk about the flood. We're going to talk about God's response to humanity's wickedness at this time. And we're also going to talk about the ark and how there are some really fascinating details in the creation of the ark. There's a lot more to it than might meet the eye the first time around, so I'm excited for that. Until then, stay curious and keep asking questions about the Uncut and Unfiltered Bible. You've been listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We hope we provided a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. If you enjoyed the podcast, be sure to share it with a friend. You can also rate and review on your podcast app to help other people find it. If you'd like to donate to keep our work going, you can subscribe at patreon.com/thebibleuncut, where you'll get exclusive access to bonus content. You can also check out our website, thebibleuncut.com, for recommended resources and more. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.